We want to talk about what it looks like to have churches that diminish shame. And we know that this is a really powerful step in changing the culture of a church, especially around the topic of sexuality. But what's cool is that when you change the culture in your church from a shame to a grace-filled or a safe space church, it's far-reaching past sexuality. So it's something that is much more inviting for all topics. So there's tons of power in a shame-free and a safe culture in our church. So that is what we're going to talk about today. So let's just start with this. No church, and I believe this wholeheartedly, no church sets out to shame their people. Pastor doesn't get up on Sunday and says, I am so excited the Holy Spirit is going to use me to shame these people today. So let's give some examples of what a church might inadvertently do that shame their people. What are some of those things you guys have seen?
Well, for me, I think you're right. Nobody starts out with that heart. But sometimes we just operate from what we've seen and what's been modeled for us. So, that shame is all around about the feeling of humiliation and disgust or disgrace because of an action. And many times trying to motivate people to right living and right behavior. I think a lot of us grew up with kind of the shameful approach of how could you better not.
Yeah.
Fear-based rather than love-based. And so many times I think the cultures are just reflective of what they grew up with. And theologically, it starts with more about that we're worthless sinners and not speaking to the core of our being. Shaming operates in giving people a negative image about themselves rather than about the impact of their behavior. So the core of our being, I believe, theologically, is that starts in Genesis 1. We're good, very good, it says, and we're made in the image of God. So the truth of our being, in my opinion, is that we're worthy of love and we're good. But sin distorts that, we know. But it's getting back to the truth of our being. And many times we try to motivate people out of fear or out of shame as a starting point.
Yeah, I think we need to look at our theology and ask a question of, where does shame come from? Because if we fast forward in Genesis to chapter 3, the shame that Adam and Eve felt was as a byproduct of their behavior or their poor choices. And God in the story is not the one who is shaming them. God is actually the one by the end of the story that's covering and dealing with their shame.
That's good.
Who's helping them come out of it. And I think if we have that view of God, because I do think maybe inadvertently there are churches that feel like they need to use shame to get people to fall into line, but really that's not consistent with, as Rodney's saying, with the heart of God. A couple of other things that I've seen or heard that I feel churches do inadvertently, it's when they do talk about human sexuality or sexual sins, and they'll refer to it as, well, if any of you struggle, or for the few of you, and immediately kind of making it a unique, minor percentage of the church, that if anyone's struggling, then they feel like, oh, great, I'm, one of the outcasts. I think also maybe leaders can have an assumption that if they don't struggle with it, that others shouldn't either. Particularly a pastor that maybe felt like, well, I had some temptations when I was a young adult, but I was able to just, claim the power of Christ and walk away. And so why can't everyone just do that? And the assumption that if you're struggling, it's because you haven't surrendered and confessed it well enough. And I think that can shame people who, in both my experience and the experience of so many men that I've been with in group, they would say that they were doing their best to confess it, to surrender it, to walk away from sexual sin or pornography or lust or whatever the topic is, and yet we're still stuck because of some patterns in their behavior and in their brain and the neurochemicals that were driving it. And if we don't see some of those patterns, then we inadvertently shame anyone that's struggling. And then the final one that I've heard happen a few times is when we will lump categories of sins together. And put in like pornography addiction along with a lot of other what we might consider really heinous crimes of murder and theft and adultery and pornography addiction. And then the man or woman who struggled lingering on a lingerie site the night before is like, oh great, I'm in the same category with the murderers. And so the last thing I'm going to do is admit that I've got that kind of struggle, because we do we maybe put sexual sin into this high category that it's like, oh man, if you struggle with that, boy, you've got issues. And I just think that keeps people in hiding because they don't want to be in that category, even if it's something they're actively struggling with. So those are a couple of things that I've seen and heard about that I feel produce shame.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think
I would say too, and add to what Nick said, when we don't just have healthy, open conversation about sexuality as a part of who we are holistically, and that subject just remains silent, then any kind of sexual challenge or question, it just doesn't go addressed. So automatically we kind of feel shame because nobody talks about that, or there's a lot of silence or secrets about that.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what creates that culture. And the only message we do get, Nick, is what you just mentioned, right? That kind of negative, the negative aspect of that. So I think inadvertently that kind of influences the culture of shame.
Yeah, and I think language is, and you guys know, being teachers, that language is really important. That if you are someone who is, and it's not this, we're not just talking to pastors, like we're talking to anybody who has any level of influence in a community or a church. And so if you are using language when you're teaching or communicating and using the word you instead of the word us or we, that immediately is going to have a more shaming effect. So, I mean, one of the really the greatest teachers that I knew of when I was growing up in the church was listening to Mark Driscoll. I thought the guy was just like a stud, and he really is a great teacher. But as I have grown and gone through recovery and realized how much shame I grew up with in the church, I started to realize that there was a difference between his teaching and a guy maybe more like Francis Chan, where the examples they'd use, the language they use, I heard Driscoll say you a lot, and I heard Francis Chan say us and we a lot. And over time, I've picked up on that. And so I think that that's one thing. I think another thing too is we tend to use examples. Again, when you're prepping, a communication or an email or a message, and you come up with specific examples, like if you were to come up with an example in pornography and you're using it only in the context of men, maybe in your mind, that it is both and, but you're cutting down, you don't want to expand or go too long on something. And so you just use one example. I would suggest that the language we use makes it gender neutral, especially in the topic of sexuality, because both genders can struggle with the exact same things. Yeah, it looks different, and maybe some of the wounds and the motivations are different, but I think that if we can stop saying, like, so when a man does this and a betrayed wife does that, if we can start to mesh the two together, that it's just when people struggle or when people are betrayed, I think that diminishes shame too for a lot of people.
Yeah. And the fact that we're sexual beings at birth. And just having language like that, integrating that the fact of our sexuality is a part of who we are as humans. It's not an act, it's a part of our humanity.
Yeah. Well, and then when someone does have the courage to admit they're struggling or battling with something, I think the way we react can inadvertently create shame. And maybe we are a little shocked and we let that come out of like, what were you thinking? Or how could you do that? Or man, this could blow up your marriage, or, oh, what a dumb idea. And maybe those things even are somewhat truthful, but that creates the shame of, I know, and it's awful and horrible. And versus if we can create a culture of, wow, I'm so proud of you for having the courage to be open about this, and we're here to help, and I love that you're asking for help, and what could we do to walk alongside of you? And there may be difficult consequences of their decisions. There may be hard stuff they have to face. It's not to in any way minimize the impact their behavior may have on their marriage or their career or whatever else. But if our response to someone's admission or openness is grace-filled, that's going to make a huge difference in how others feel about potentially revealing what's going on in their life as well.
Yep.